Hamas has wounded us. They are responsible for all the destruction. All the destruction is on them. May God settle the score with Hamas, take revenge on Hamas. They destroyed our lives. These are the words of Palestinians in Gaza. These are the voices that Hamas and the members of the proposition don't want you to hear. These are the voices they want you to silence. We want you to rule, they say. We don't want Hamas. They took away the humanitarian aid. We will be killed if we say anything. The Jews bring us food, give us humanitarian corridor. May God take revenge on those who uprooted and killed us, Hamas.
Was there a moment, for example, at Oxford University where you realized the room had decided the moral outcome before the argument even began?
Yeah, before I got there, for sure. I was at Oxford and I was an active member of the Oxford Union when I was at university. It has been clear to me for some time that that organisation unfortunately went entirely off the rails and became so discredited. And yet, I took up that invitation. And not only that, I ensured that we had a very strong team, including Jonathan Sachadoti, renowned journalist and commentator and now podcaster, and importantly, 2 Arab voices on this subject, Yusuf Haddad and the so-called Green Prince, son of Hamas, Mossab Hassan Yusuf. Those were 2 voices that the organisers at the union were very reluctant to give a platform to, but nonetheless had to, on the basis that we stood there as a team, or none of us would participate. That was an ultimatum that we had to give to the Oxford Union when they were seeking to deplatform the Arab contributors to this debate, even before the evening had begun. And then, of course, upon arrival, the manner in which we were all treated left nothing to the imagination in terms of how this evening had been set up. So there was no question really of going to persuade or necessarily to win the debate. And that much was also clear when the first speaker, goodness, whose name now escapes me, left immediately after his speech. He gave his speech, made a series of very egregious false accusations against Israel, and then disappeared from the chamber. We also had one of the team members of the proposition, Norman Finkelstein, who pulled out immediately before the debate as well. So, I mean, the setup was a circus, but I think it was important to demonstrate that circus by attending. And I think the very fact of our attendance and the decorum with which those members of the opposition benches conducted themselves was such a stark foil, such a stark contrast to the shockingly rude, aggressive, threatening display from both the proposition speakers, but also the people that the union had essentially packed the union chamber with, all, decked out in keffiyehs. It made it so much more important to go and to present the reality, the legal position, the proper narrative, the facts, and that argument. I have to say, by the time I actually got up to deliver my speech, it was 11:40 p.m. The conduct of the evening had been so farcical, so I was exhausted. I don't know what I necessarily delivered, but it's easier, I think, to maintain, if you will, that sense of calm when the facts and the law and the history is on your side. I've never found that actually to be very much of a challenge. And I think throughout many of the encounters that I've had over the last couple of years, the more irate, hysterical, shouty that the other side become, the easier it is just to, come back to the facts and the evidence. And certainly, that's what I do in my day job, in my profession as a barrister. One would never lose one's cool in court, so I wouldn't treat this particular arena any differently.
Well, I just want to confirm something. The Oxford Union, when they posted Mossab's video, they posted a censored version. Apparently, they wanted to throw him out, and it was your argument that saved him. Is that correct? Or
that was my reading of the situation. It was extraordinary, and it doesn't quite come across on the recordings. But yes, he was being viciously attacked by members of the audience. And I understand from him afterwards, my Arabic isn't great, so I didn't know what was being said. But the nature of the comments and the remarks and the threats that were being made to him are the worst that you can possibly imagine, were the worst. And in that context, the inversion of the reaction by the president, rather than to expel those who were in such flagrant breach of the union's rules, demonstrating such aggression, hostility, and threats of truly violent abuse towards an invited speaker, rather than expelling them, the president did indicate that Mossab would not be permitted to continue his speech and would be escorted out of the chamber. I don't know if my words shamed the president into reversing his decision, but there was a complete 180 after I called out that behavior. And in a sense, perhaps because I was able to invoke, my own experience of that union, an organization that I once had such tremendous respect for. In fact, I have to tell you, when I was accepted to read law at Oxford, the very first thing I did was immediately work out the process for joining the Oxford Union. I was a debater at school and university. It was such a big part of my university experience there. And I think perhaps, the confidence and perhaps even the area of authority that might have given me, given that the debate itself, as all events at the union was being run by students, that might have tipped the balance. But I am glad that decision was revoked. Unfortunately, however, when I called on the president to take action, there were many, many police outside of the chamber. And when there was a violation of the law of England and Wales and a breach, an offence, in fact, under the Terrorism Act by Miko Peled, when he praised Hamas and the events of the 7th of October, the president didn't heed my warning and my request that he alert the police to that having occurred. And so unfortunately, that wasn't dealt with on the evening. But that's reflective of how that institution has fallen so very badly.
What do you think has changed at Oxford since you attended there? Like, what can explain their downfall?
So it's a trend and a pattern that we have seen throughout so many universities. I don't care to recall how long ago my time at Oxford was, but it was already very much in train then. There was great support for anti-Israel speakers when they came. The university organizations that were Israel-related or Jewish-related did tend to have difficulty hosting events because of security issues. The university was not generally particularly supportive. This was, of course, before organizations like Stand With Us and Camera on Campus had a presence really in the United Kingdom. And so I think these days students themselves who wish to conduct debates about Israel, have speakers from Israel, have a great deal more support from student organizations. But what we have seen throughout the academy has been this, collective Kool-Aid drinking on Israel, and the encampments that we witnessed after the 7th of October, which were, just as prominent at Oxford as they were in so many other elite institutions, that to me is reflective of a few very significant trends. One is the teaching of shame and guilt over so-called Western colonialism and the atrocities committed by the West. These are essentially placed upon students at these institutions, especially if they happen to be, of white British origin, and they are made to feel responsible and guilty for what they are told is the wrongdoing of previous generations. That, coupled with, I think, a general lack of purpose amongst, if I say the younger generations, I sound a bit like a grandma, but you know what I mean, a general lack of purpose and pride in the Western liberal democracies that many of these students have had the great privilege of growing up in, pride in the freedoms that they enjoy. And so you've got this perfect storm, a sense of purpose that is being offered to them, even if it involves camping out in support of an internationally prescribed terrorist organization. It enables them to feel part of something. And, the donning of that uniform of the keffiyeh, the mindless repeating of these slogans, these genocidal chants from the river to the sea, especially after the 7th of October, celebrating that resistance by all means necessary. And so much of what we've, of course, seen across campuses on the US, that is reflective of that shame, that guilt that has been imposed on these young people, and really this complete absence of purpose, which these pro-terror organizations have been able to fill that void and create a very powerful movement. That is also underpinned by so much of the teaching and what is happening in the classrooms and the rewriting of curricula, especially around the Middle East, to demonize Israel, to target Israel. And nowhere is that more powerful, I believe, than in the International Legal Academy, and how international law is being warped and manipulated and abused, essentially as a modern manifestation of anti-Semitism. Lord Sachs, the former chief rabbi of the United Kingdom, the late great Rabbi Sachs, he talked about anti-Semitism as a mutating virus. And what began as a focus on the Jewish religion mutated to a focus on the Jewish race. It now focuses on the Jewish state. And it is international law that is the critical mechanism, the delivery mechanism of that modern manifestation of anti-Semitism. And in so many respects, international organizations, they play a significant role in this. We can come on to discuss some of the ways in which they do that. But the universities, especially because they play such a significant role in the development of international law, the writings of the greatest jurists of the era are considered, in fact, to be a source of international law, a secondary source, but a source nonetheless. And that is immense power within universities, within the academy. And that perfect storm that we've been seeing for many decades now really came to fruition after the 7th of October.
All of the falsehoods we have heard from the proposition this evening, their support for terror, the strengthening, essentially, of the oppressors, not just Hamas, but Hezbollah, the Houthis, other Iranian proxies in Iraq and in Syria. They oppress Palestinians and Israelis alike. Now, this disgraceful motion and the pretty shameful manner in which it has been handled this evening discredits this once illustrious institution. And that Jewish students have also felt intimidated from attending tonight is an extremely sad state of affairs. But I think anyone watching this debate will probably understand why. This is a dark moment in the Oxford Union's history, and as a member of this institution and a committed attendee in my time at this university, I think it is a very sad day on that front too. Now, those who cannot argue their case flee like cowards, like Norman Finkelstein, who pulled out at the last moment and in fact now seems to be scheduled to speak tomorrow unopposed, or like Muhammad al-Kurd, who also, like a coward, left after his speech because he could not face the truth that you have heard from the opposition benches. This debate has been predicated on a slew of falsehoods and misinformation. And in answer to the lady's point from the floor, red lines have been crossed this evening. I don't just refer to support for terrorism and to law enforcement watching. I do highlight Section 12(1)(a) of the Terrorism Act 2000. Calling the 7th of October a heroic act is something that is and ought to be recognized as unlawful in this country. But we've also heard made-up facts, made-up allegations, made-up quotes. No, Ben-Gurion did not say that he wanted to expel the Arabs. He said that attackers would be removed. He called on the Arabs to join the Jews in building the state of Israel. And his quote was, "We do not want to expel the Arabs. We do not have to expel the Arabs." The Israeli Arab who was ejected from this chamber in a pretty shameful development and an exhibition of double standards, which unfortunately Israelis, both Jewish and Arab, have come to acknowledge and expect. He is proof of the 20% of Israel's population that are the only free Arabs in the Middle East, that live with full citizen rights, and that put the lie to everything that you have heard from the opposition this evening. I dream, in fact, of a day when people stop making up those falsehoods, those allegations, those lies, when people stop making up those quotes, because even Benny Morris acknowledged he was mistaken when he reported it. And a little bit of research, ladies and gentlemen, which is something this university is so good, I think, at instilling in its students, would have assisted the opposition substantially in this debate. We heard the essence, essentially, of the advice, the optimism from the opposition, from the proposition benches. The Israelis, what should they do? They should live in Palestine and under Palestinian rule. We saw the result of two reservists losing their way and finding themselves in Ramallah in the year 2000. When they went to a local police station for help, they were lynched. Their livers were eaten. And that image of one of their attackers holding up his bloodied hands to the window towards the baying crowd below, that image of the red hand has been a central part of the propaganda initiative so that Hollywood members have been wearing red badges and celebrating the slaughter of Jews and urging it to continue. This is not a chicken and an egg scenario. This is not a situation, and we've heard so many examples from the proposition so far. Israel has done X, Y, Z, which have never been shown or been substantiated. The creation of the State of Israel in 1948 followed massacres of Jews. The Hebron massacre in 1929. In fact, Arabs have been massacring Jews in the Middle East for centuries. This is not a chicken and an egg scenario. But we have been asked for historical and we've been asked specifically for historical context. And what I'm going to provide to you is something that hasn't come up, which is extraordinary in the context of a discussion of two legal terms, genocide, apartheid. The lack of historical context and the lack of legal context has been palpable. But I am here, so fear not, ladies and gentlemen. Apartheid and genocide. Well, like colonialism, ethnic cleansing, occupation, all of the other blood libels that we've heard from the proposition benches this evening, the insidious nature of these allegations is that they take the victims of a crime and they accuse those victims of committing the very crime that was imposed on them. Apartheid is a prime example. Where is there apartheid in this region, ladies and gentlemen? If we just look at the area from the river to the sea, the West Bank, Palestinian-controlled territory. And yes, the Palestinians have self-governance. They have an autonomy after the Oslo Accords established in areas A and B, where that self-governance has meant that part of the world is Jew-free. Judenrein. You've heard that word before somewhere. Jew-free also, as in Gaza, since Israel's withdrawal in 2005. Every Jew was ripped from their homes. Even the dead ones were dug up so that they could not be desecrated when that territory was handed over to Palestinian self-governance. There is apartheid, ladies and gentlemen. Herein is another perfect example of complete nonsense that seems to be opium for the masses. Gaza has a border with Egypt. And it is somewhere, unlike everyone who has spoken in this debate, I actually went to in September on the ground in Gaza and inspecting the tunnels that exist under the border between Gaza and the Egyptians. One of them was big enough to drive military-grade vehicles through. There was soot on the walls because of the vehicles that had come backwards and forwards, resupplying Hamas with Iranian military might right under an Egyptian command tower. So I invite anyone who is taken in by this nonsense simply to look at a map. Apartheid, you have heard debunked by those that have grown up in Israel and experienced it, the opportunities that Israeli Arabs have. The lie is perpetrated by infantilizing the Palestinians and ignoring the self-governance that exists in Gaza, in the West Bank. And organizations like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch lie about what the position is. They conflate Israeli Arabs, such as the gentleman who was ejected from this chamber. They conflate Israeli Arabs with those who have self-determination under the autonomy of the Palestinian Authority. But then we come to this obscene allegation of genocide. And yes, the term coined by the Jewish jurist Raphael Lemkin in the aftermath of the Holocaust to provide a legal terminology to the Jewish experience of being targeted because they were Jews for extermination. And when the proposition referred to the definition, they left out two very critical words. As such, this is to do with intentionally targeting a group as such because of the group that they belong to. That was the Jewish experience in the Holocaust. It was also the experience of Jews on the 7th of October, when those acts that delusional third speaker referred to as heroic deliberately targeted Jews because they were Jews for rape, slaughter, torture, mutilation, and kidnap. If they cannot acknowledge that, they have much bigger problems than the ones that they profess to you this evening. Genocide is a slur being alleged against the real victims of genocide in this case, because it is providing a legal hook.
Would be heard.
A legal hook. I'm glad actually that there is an opportunity for someone to be heard that can speak about what the ICJ actually found so far in the genocide case. Because unlike the speakers who have been invited this term, including Hussam Zumlot, who repeatedly lies about what was found by the International Court of Justice in their provisional measures order, and unfortunately he wasn't challenged when he was here as a guest earlier this term, the ICJ has not found that there is plausible genocide or a risk of plausible genocide or anything of the sort. And I honestly thought that after Joan Donoghue, the former president of the ICJ, went on hard talk on the BBC to correct this falsehood, it would stop being repeated, but clearly not in institutions like the Oxford Union. Genocide is simply the latest version of the blood libel that is being propagated against Jews because they are Jews. And it is a blood libel not because it is targeting Jews, but because it is false. It is the falsehoods that have been coming out of the proposition benches this evening that are nothing new, because unfortunately, the oldest hatred, the hatred of the Jews, goes hand in hand with lies about them. Then we have this notion of colonialism. When one considers who the indigenous people in that territory are, Jews, indigenous to Judea, the notion that Israel is a colonial entity is laughable. One only needs to look at the archaeology. One of the major focuses, though, of this allegation of genocide is the falsehoods that we've heard about the last 13 months of Israel's campaign against Hamas and other Palestinian terrorist groups in Gaza. And when I was there, I also witnessed the challenges that the IDF was dealing with. Civilian houses booby-trapped in order to try and kill as many IDF soldiers as possible as they sweep through these areas seeking to evacuate civilians and target the Hamas who embed themselves in them. The notion that even the use of human shields that Hamas is proud of was disputed this evening starts to reveal the ridiculous position that the proposition have adopted. But there are root causes here, very important root causes that actually go hand in hand with all of the falsehoods that we have heard. It is either being put to you from a position of ignorance, or there is something far more malicious behind the falsehoods that have been repeated, emphasized, embellished even over the course of this evening. Indoctrination is at the core of the perpetuation of this conflict. When Palestinian kids are taught from kindergarten up that the highest calling in life is to slaughter as many Jews as possible and become a martyr, peace is being pushed further and further away. What nonsense? 3/4 of the terrorists who crossed the border on the 7th of October were educated in UNRWA-run schools. It is a matter of public record what the Palestinian Authority-approved curriculum teaches in these UNRWA-run schools. And in fact, when I was on Trigonometry, the podcast, only a few months ago, they had the great initiative of playing some of Palestinian children's TV programs as part of that interview. This is material that many people, especially in this country, have never been exposed to. I encourage you to view it, because it will tell you everything that you need to know about the bloodlust and the terrorism and the indoctrination that is going to push this conflict on for decades more unless it is grappled with and unless the international community's complicity in it is likewise grappled with. But it is not just the indoctrination, but also the incentivization to terror. Forgive me, I'm going to take the same amount of time as those on the opposition benches. That means I've got another 5 minutes. We have heard very little this evening about the Palestinian Authority Pay for Slay program, which encourages terrorism by rewarding terrorists according to how many Jews they have slaughtered, the severity of their sentence, their time in Israeli prisons. And this is directly linked to the 7th of October, because Ali Kadhi and the others who spent 2 years organizing those attacks, there was nothing heroic about it, were paid salaries by the Palestinian Authority while they were organizing those barbarous medieval-style atrocities. The so-called moderates in this equation, really? They're also incentivizing the continuation of that genocidal war against the Jews. Now, one of the massive areas of misinformation this evening has been the issue of aid being provided by Israel into the Gaza Strip, being facilitated. I checked the COGAT website over the course of this debate. I had quite a lot of time on my hands, ladies and gentlemen. 1,149,932 tons of aid. That's 58,101 trucks. 1% of the international aid, the trucks that the international community has attempted to send into Gaza, Israel has stopped for security reasons. And the calorie count is significant because over 3,000 calories a day have been going into the Gaza Strip per individual there. Why? Why do we not hear criticism calling out of the causes of Palestinian suffering? The quotes that I read out to you at the very beginning of my speech were against Hamas. But it's not just Hamas that has contributed to this. Where is the condemnation of Egypt? Where are the calls for Egypt to comply with its international law obligations? Those that it signed up to in the African Union Convention on Refugees, that it acceded to in 1980, to open the border and allow the passage of civilians fleeing civil disorder in Gaza. Those are its international law obligations. I haven't heard anything from the proposition on that this evening, which is why I agree with the rest of my speakers. They don't care about the Palestinians. Their focus is on the eradication of the state of Israel, and they are peddling in blood libels to seek to achieve it. We had the speaker who left the debate, I mean, in and of itself, a rather shameful disregard for the tradition of the Oxford Union, referenced, in fact, his own case of Sheikh Jarrah, a property that was purchased in 1875 by two rabbis and put into family trust, that was then seized by Jordan when it ethnically cleansed the Jews of East Jerusalem and occupied that territory in 1948. That property that Mohammed al-Kurd was referring to came into the hands of the Jordanian custodian of enemy property. And instead of transferring the ownership of that property, which would have later even been respected, albeit being unlawful, forgive me, but the other speakers had quite a deal longer. I've been keeping time, 20 minutes on the last count. So that Jordanian custodian of enemy property issued a couple of leases over it. Now, leases require rent and they require compliance with the conditions. Neither of those have been forthcoming from the first speaker from the opposition and his cohabitants. Illegal squatters who have been given time after time, in fact, 50 years of litigation by the courts in Israel, an opportunity to get their house in order. But of course, they have no regard to the law. They have no regard to the facts. Ladies and gentlemen, what we have seen on display this evening is a continuation and a perpetuation of the falsehoods against Israel in order to draw you into those falsehoods. There have been references to useful idiots this evening in response to some of the comments from the floor. I do not believe that you are useful idiots. You would not be at this institution if you were. So,
could the secretary give the speaker 1 more minute the same way Susan had?
Well, I was going to go to the end of the time of the previous speaker because I stick to rules and precedent. Let us not be under any illusions here. We all know what this audience is, where your allegiances lie. You've made that very plain this evening. We all know what the outcome of this vote is going to be. That is not important. What is important is that ultimately the truth will out. What is important is that all of those Jewish students who are too intimidated to come tonight will have an opportunity to come not only to hear the truth in future, but in future to speak the truth. And that will be occasioned because brave members of the opposition benches this evening have called out the falsehoods, have called out the lies in the face of opposition, even from the union authorities in organizing this debate. The shame of this evening, I hope, will be overcome because in future years, there will be debates where the rules, procedure, and decorum are respected. And there will be debates when it is not just the speakers here on the opposition that are calling out these falsehoods and that are seeking a peace and a future built on real history, real law, real facts. Thank you.